Thank you very much.
Campaign.
Man, while we're in the family, there's Bill Doob up there, who's Gary Eisenbraun's green thumb.
And my friend and colleague in the Senate, Dick Clark, delegates, officers, and friends of the South Dakota Farmers Union, I feel that I've been twice blessed today in having a second opportunity to appear at this convention. We had an interesting open forum discussion this morning with all of the incumbents and candidates for high office in our state. And I have the privilege now tonight to return to introduce my friend Dick Clark. That's really my function here this evening. I really came back to this session tonight after a meeting in DeSmet earlier this evening for two reasons. First, because I was invited to introduce Senator Clark, but secondly, because I wanted to express my personal and deep-felt gratitude and friendship to the members of this great farm organization for what you have meant to me over the years. I've been in the public life of this state now for some 20 years, and no organization that it has been my privilege to come to know in those years has meant more to me in terms of good advice and good counsel and good support than the members of the South Dakota Farmers Union. We frequently in public life, we're under pressure as members of the Senate to vote for special interest considerations. All of us have been lobbied by groups of all kinds, but in the 16 years that I've served, 4 years in the House and almost 12 years in the Senate, not once has any official spokesman for the Farmers Union, either nationally or statewide, ever asked me to support a dishonorable piece of legislation or a dishonorable action connected with my responsibilities in the Senate. And I think that's a great credit to your organization. Now, there are so many personalities here tonight that bring back special memories to me, and I'm just going to mention one. Amyl Oryx is sitting out here in the audience. When I first came to know him, I was a young combat flyer just back from World War II. I had been living at Mitchell then for many years, and he and Paul Upsall were then the major officers of the South Dakota Farmers Union. The office was then at Mitchell in a little building, a little office in the Western building. I was teaching at Dakota Wesleyan. I came to know them first as a student there and then later as an instructor. And through them, I've come to meet so many other people in your organization, including Ben Radcliffe, your able president, who has introduced me not only tonight, but has sponsored me in so many ways and so helpfully over the years. I want to say about Ben that I admire him not only because of the way he has led this organization, but because of the kind of man he is. He's carried on the best traditions of agriculture, of agricultural leadership, in the tradition of Amyl Oryx, Paul Upsall, and M.W. Thatcher, and so many others whose names are known to everyone in this room, and it's an honor to be here as his guest and as your guest tonight. Senator Clark and I got an unexpected call today. We're going to have to leave very early in the morning to go back to Washington to vote on an effort to override a presidential veto of the railway retirement bill. The House overrode that veto today, and we're due to vote at 2:30 tomorrow. This doesn't complicate things for Senator Clark quite as much as it does me, because he's not running for election this year. But I had to cancel out a whole series of meetings tomorrow. I'm going to have to drive to Mitchell tonight and get on the telephone and do some telephonic recordings. So if I walk out after completing my part of the program, which is to introduce Senator Clark, I hope you won't think it's because I don't want to hear what he has to say. Senator Clark came to the Senate just 2 years ago, and he was immediately assigned to the Committee on Agriculture. I've been on that committee for 12 years, and I've seen a number of new senators come to Washington and join that committee. And of all of those that have joined that committee as new senators, coming there for their first assignment, there isn't one that has impressed me as much as Senator Clark, our neighbor from Iowa. We're so fortunate to have him here as our speaker tonight. He's a brilliant student of agriculture. When he speaks on agricultural issues and on other problems that are related to it, you will hear a man who has thought out his positions carefully. He's built up a staff that is the admiration of many of us who have been in the Senate for some time. He's educated himself on the complicated issues that we face in the Senate in such a way that he commands the respect of senators on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats alike. And I have no doubt at all that he has a great future ahead of him for his state, for himself, for all the people of this country. We're going to have another visitor in our state tomorrow. The President of the United States is coming to South Dakota. I was asked by someone as I came in the room tonight if I was disturbed about that. I want to say I'm not disturbed at all. I say in all sincerity that it's always an honor when the President of the United States visits South Dakota, whether he's a Democrat or a Republican. We may have our differences on certain issues, but I think when a president makes a trip of this kind and comes into an area like ours, it may serve to give him a better understanding of the impact of some of these problems that we have, the problems of inflation, the livestock crisis, and other critical concerns before the people of our state. I must say I was a little surprised to read on the front page of the Huron-Plainsman tonight that there are some people who have a little different view of the president's visit. There's a headline that you may or may not have seen if you haven't read the paper yet tonight, in the Huron paper, which says Thorsness hopes Ford's visit won't damage bid. And the article goes on to say that he's very worried about the impact of the presidential pardon and the surcharge. And then to quote my opponent, he says, "I think I can be very honest to say it would have helped the Republican Party had these decisions been postponed until after the election." Well, I agree with that. I think it might have helped them a little more if those decisions had been postponed. On the other hand, I think it's good to know what they have in mind, what the plans are after the election. It's good to see those things out on the table before the election. But in Senator Clark, we have a senator who made history in Iowa by walking from one end of that state to another. He was not well known when he started his campaign 3 years ago. He walked through every county in that state. It worked out a little more successfully for him than it has for some others that have tried that technique. But I'm so proud to introduce my colleague the junior senator from Iowa, and he's about to become the senior senator with the announced resignation of Senator Hughes at the end of his current term. So let's welcome Senator Dick Clark to Huron, and we'll both be returning to Washington to do the people's business on tomorrow. Thank you so much, Senator Clark.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you for your warm welcome. I appreciate very greatly the invitation to be with you this evening in McGovern-Aberest territory. The past week in Washington, as I guess with the one just ahead of us, has been a very hectic one. And I must say that it's great to get back in the Midwest to visit a neighbor where we don't have any smog or any haze. It's great to be back really in the open country. I was hoping that I could bring you some good news, that Earl Butz was looking for a new job. But unfortunately, I have no such report. I understand that President Ford is going to be here in South Dakota tomorrow, and perhaps you can ask him how much longer we're going to have Butz to kick around. Some of you, I'm sure, are going to be going down to that meeting. And I don't mean to talk too bluntly, but I'm very fond of a great American, Harry Truman, who always told it like it is. I remember some of you may have heard the story about Harry, many stories about how bluntly he spoke. One that I'm fond of that really happened took place down in Kansas City, not far from Harry's hometown of Independence. He and his wife, Bess, were down there. He was talking to a number of industrialists in Kansas City, and Harry was very much interested in agriculture, as you know, and about modern fertilizers and seed corn and so forth, and he would often speak to metropolitan audience, city audiences about that. And he was speaking one night to a particular group of bankers and industrialists, and he was talking about manure, horse manure and cow manure and so forth. And as he spoke away about this, he leaned over, one of Bess's socialite friends leaned over to Bess, and she said, "Bess, after all these years, can't you get Harry to say fertilizer instead of manure?" She said, "Listen, it's taken me all these years just to get him to say manure." Of course, you know, in American politics, a lot of interesting things happen. You don't have to make up stories. I've had a great number of them happen in my brief time in politics. One in particular that I thought of as we had the prayer tonight that really happened. My own daughter, Julianne, who was very young when we moved to Washington 2 years ago, was rather confused, she and her brother, about all of the hullabaloo of getting ready and packing and getting ready to move. And we, of course, were so busy we didn't pay much attention until I noticed the day before we were going to move, that she was rather confused about it. And I said to my wife, we ought to sit down and talk with them about it, explain what we're doing. We'd been busy all that year on a campaign. And so we sat down, and I explained to her that tomorrow we were going to pack up the car, leave Iowa, go 1,000 miles east to Washington, D.C., where we'd get a new home, we'd make new friends, find a new school, new church. And she was very impressed by that, and she listened. She didn't say much. And that night when she was saying her prayers, at the end she said, "Now, God bless Mommy, and God bless Daddy, and Grandma and Grandpa. And now, God, this is goodbye, because tomorrow we leave for Washington." I didn't realize how much that girl knew at the time, but after having been out there a couple of years, I realized she had some real insights. Now, I enjoy having an opportunity to speak to the Farmers Union here in South Dakota, as I have on 2 or 3 occasions now with our organization in the state of Iowa. And it's a special pleasure for me to be able to be here and to speak in part on behalf of my good friend George McGovern. We've started out, in fact, this morning, I did, in Sioux Falls. We've had meetings here in Huron. But I particularly enjoy having an opportunity to speak to a farm audience. The American farmer certainly has no better friend in the United States than George McGovern. And I serve on the Senate Agriculture Committee with him, as he said, and I can tell you that there are few people who have done more for American agriculture than George McGovern. His 12 years in the Senate, and indeed 4 years prior to that in the House of Representatives, gives him broad experience. He's introduced in that period, since he's been in the Senate, more than 50 bills to strengthen agriculture and help farmers. More than half of these bills have become law. Now, he doesn't just introduce bills, as many people do. He passes them into law. Anybody can introduce a bill. It's something else to get it through both houses of Congress and signed by the President. Additionally, he has co-sponsored and vigorously worked for approximately 100 other related agricultural bills, and many of these are now the law of the land. Now, if anyone in the United States Senate has done more than that and can top that, I'd like to know who it is. Now, I've heard rumors here in South Dakota that George's Republican opponent, I can't say his name, and I'm not going to learn now because I'm not going to need it, but I've heard that he's questioned somewhat the effectiveness in the Senate in terms of representing farmers. Well, that simply is no question about that. George McGovern is one of the most effective, articulate spokesmen for American agriculture that this nation has. I know that. Everyone in Washington knows that. It doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. It's not a partisan question at all. And it's very, very important, I think, and most important, that those of you here in South Dakota know that. Now, if I can personally manage in my period on the Agriculture Committee, and I hope that I'm going to be there a very long time, I'm going to be there as long as I'm in the Senate at any rate, if I can accomplish 1/2 of what George McGovern's been able to accomplish in that period of time, I will be very happy indeed. Incidentally, the three of us sit on the Democratic side, of course. George McGovern, Hubert Humphrey, who's another hometown boy, it now occurs to me, from here in Huron, who's certainly made good. Hubert and George and I sit together on the Democratic side of the Agriculture Committee. And as your president said, important thing for you to remember is that he is next in line to be chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee. I sit clear down at the end of the table, incidentally. He sits up next to the chairman. And I urge you not to throw away that kind of seniority for total inexperience. I admit that there are some prejudices because George and I and Hubert serve together and have many common interests. The three of us are the only members of the majority party from the wheat and corn belt, an area of American agriculture which has not always had its voice heard in the committee or on the floor of the Senate. So if you believe it's important to keep a strong voice there representing you, and by you I mean the wheat farmers and the corn farmers, then you'd better take these last 20 days before this election. Contact your friends and your neighbors to to get him reelected. Because if you don't, the rest of us in this country are simply not going to forgive you. Now, we're going to end the talking tonight, and tomorrow morning, I urge you to continue your work. Now, there's one thing in particular that makes working with people like you on legislation, and I've had occasion to meet some of you here from South Dakota in Washington who've been in working on legislation. There's one thing I think that makes serving in the Congress and working with you most rewarding. No single group has more divergent views on the best way to be represented in the government than the American farmer. And no single group is less reluctant to make those views known. And that's what the democratic process is really all about. Whether the question is a grain reserve or the qualifications of the Secretary of Agriculture, the farmers of this country have an opinion. And more often than not, it's a well-informed and well-reasoned opinion. That diversity of opinion and your willingness to express it is one of the strengths of American agriculture, and don't you ever forget it. Don't ever stop, because it means that when Congress considers legislation that affects your interests, then your interests are known before that decision is made. And it means that Congress can pass legislation that is in the best interest of American agriculture and Americans generally. That's why this kind of a meeting is so important. And that's why your own participation in the political process, whether you're a Democrat or an independent or a Republican, is so essential if American agriculture is going to have sound representation in the Congress and in the state houses of America. Now, for all the debate and controversy over farm issues, there is unanimity in one belief: that the American economy and the American spirit rests on a foundation built in no small part by the American farmer. Now, that's one of the things that I'd like to discuss very briefly here at the outset. That American spirit and something about the American economy and its relationship to agriculture. It's clear now, for the first time in my lifetime, that all across this country, people are beginning to realize the importance of American agriculture. Farm news is now headline news, not just in the farm papers, not just in the Des Moines Register or the Dakota papers, but in the metropolitan papers, in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun. All of these papers now, in fact, yesterday's Wall Street Journal, a long front-page article about a farmer in Atlantic, Iowa. Because people are beginning to see the relationship between American agriculture and the rest of the economy of this country and indeed of the world. They watch now. I have metropolitan congressmen and senators come up and talk about the yields and the drought and the flood and the early frost, something that never used to occur. They know that the Department of Agriculture, for example, grossly overestimated the 1974 crop. They know that the impact of our yields, they know that it's going to have an enormous impact on their constituency and on themselves. Because agriculture, as you well know, is this country's biggest industry. It employs 4.5 million people, almost as many, to show you some comparison, almost as many as the transportation, steel, and automotive industries combined. Farming and its supporting industries account now for 10% of the gross national product of this economy. That is, all of the products and services of the American economy. And the productivity that this represents is one of the greatest economic success stories of this or any other time. 200 years ago, this country began, like other countries, like all other countries, as a strictly agricultural society. And ever since then, the number of farms and the number of farmers has declined. But your productivity has vastly increased. That's the only reason we've been able to avoid disastrous balance of payment problems. A farmer today produces enough food for 51 people. 20 years ago only, the same farmer on the same land would have produced enough for only 15 people. And nothing in the world can compare with the quality of the product and its value. Even with the recent increases in food prices on the supermarket shelf, the average family in this country spends only about 16 cents out of every dollar on food. In Europe, that's double. In the developing countries, families spend as much as 80% of their income on food. And so the American farmer does much more than just provide food for the people of this country. Agriculture is the only thing that's keeping our international checkbook in balance. In the year that just ended, on June 30th, the last fiscal year, the United States exported $21 billion in agricultural products and helped the dollar retain its integrity. Because you know, on this new floating system, if we'd had a greater imbalance of trade, or if we have, that means that the dollar is automatically devalued, with all the effects that that has on the soundness of the dollar. The record next year, this year in fact, will not be nearly as good. The decrease in average yield and the increase in oil prices cannot help but affect the balance of trade adversely, and we've already begun to see the figures. But the importance of the American farmer to this country's economy and the world economy is absolutely indisputable. The administration's export embargo policies, which were enacted 10 days ago, could prove to be disastrous to a continued healthy export trade. I say they could be. I'm not opposed to a monitoring system, but I am opposed to sharp and precipitous cutoffs in agreed contracts. After spending millions to develop overseas markets for wheat and corn, we take this precipitous action in one weekend, which can go a long way toward destroying our credibility in the free market system. If we continue this policy of canceling contracts to our customers, we will have wheat and corn standing in the streets of our cities and towns all across the Midwest, because you know, 2 out of every 3 acres of wheat goes overseas. A lot of people don't understand that. We were at a coffee this afternoon here in Huron, George and I. A couple of you were there whom I've seen tonight. And a woman, very logically, as will happen with every meeting that one has with non-farmers, brought up the question, why should we ship our wheat overseas? Why don't we keep it here, keep our food prices down? Well, the reason, and George explained it well, if we kept all of our wheat here, we'd be covered up with it in a very short period of time. That's the whole basis of our agricultural economy. 1/4 of all the corn we raise in this country has to be sold overseas. We can only use 3/4 of it. Half of all our soybeans, 2/3 of all our wheat. And so we need it for American agriculture, for a healthy American agriculture. We need it for a healthy national economy. And I think this action is a very sad one indeed. And I hope now that with the investigations we've had these last 10 days and the expressions that we've had, that the President and the Secretary of Agriculture and others in the administration are going to look much more carefully before ending contracts as we did on that occasion. Now, the incredible achievements of American agriculture have occurred because of the efforts of millions of individual family farmers across this country. There are large corporations increasingly involved in farming. but they simply are not as productive, in my judgment, as a family farm, and I suspect that they never will be. Quite frankly, I would be opposed to that development even if you could prove beyond doubt that they were more effective. You know, economic effectiveness is not the only important thing in people's lives. But a man and his wife and their children, all of whom have a shared interest in growing a crop, in keeping a home, in the land, and a dream for the future, are competition that no large impersonal corporation can compete with for very long. And George McGovern and I, as long as we are in the United States Senate and on the Senate Agriculture Committee, are going to work for legislation that will at least give the family farm a fair break in that competition. But as I say, not only is the family farm or ranch the most practical and economical food production factory in the world, it's a prime source of the traditional values that have made this country great. And we forget that sometimes. Over the last few years, there's been a great deal of worry about these traditional values. People have wondered what's happened to them. And given all that has happened in this last year, indeed in these last several years, that wonder is not difficult to understand. And at times it does seem that honesty, hard work, compassion, and common sense have lost their position as the fundamental principles that have made this country what it indeed is today. And I don't think they're lost. I just think they've been misplaced by a few people, because nowhere are they more alive or well than they are in American agriculture and in the family farm. Without those traditional values, the family farm wouldn't amount to much, and neither would this country. Now, if you believe in the viability of the family farm, the necessity of it, as I do, as I know George McGovern does, then I say to you that it's time to go out on the highways and the roads of this state and to the farmhouses and to tell people that you believe in George McGovern and in the family farm. Now, I've talked tonight principally about the importance of American agriculture, not only in this country's economy, but in its heart, in those traditional values. And now I'd like to speak just for 3 or 4 minutes in ending to talk about what I think the government can be doing. Government policy, what those of us on the agriculture committees and in the Senate and the House ought to be doing this next year with regard to government policy if we're going to see American agriculture prosper. The government and agriculture has been inextricably involved in each other's business now for well over 100 years, ever since President Lincoln first established the Department of Agriculture and they began to disperse seed. That relationship, of course, hasn't always been a good one. It hasn't always been productive. At times, government has meddled too much with farming, and at times it hasn't been concerned enough. But government, in my judgment, does have a legitimate role to play in American agriculture. And as long as government represents people, and people want to continue the habit of eating, then it has a legitimate role. And since those engaged in agricultural production are only about 5 or 6% of the consuming population, farmers and ranchers rightfully wonder if they're getting a fair shake from either the USDA or the Congress. And indeed, the political deck is stacked against you in many ways. That's obvious. At present, there are only about 60 of the 435 members of Congress who represent truly agricultural districts, or even agriculturally oriented districts. But that doesn't mean you're beaten just because you're outnumbered. Urban congressmen, as I said at the outset, are becoming increasingly aware of the importance of an adequate supply of food for their constituencies. And their constituents continue to remind them of that. And so the time is really close at hand, I think, when we can get some reasonable farm legislation passed, if we cooperate a little and go about explaining the interdependency of this economy. John Kennedy was fond of talking about how a rising tide carries all the boats. We're all in this together. As the bishop said this noon at the United Nations luncheon, when we begin to understand the interdependency of all of us, urban and rural, then we begin to solve those problems. That's why I'm a strong supporter of George McGovern, because he has the respect not just of the agricultural interests of this country, but of Republicans and Democrats, House members and Senate, rural and urban. And that's what it takes. We can't have a narrow approach. We have to have the cooperation of everybody in this nation to have a great economy. We don't have to promise an agricultural producer that he's going to get rich to motivate him. Just give him some fair treatment and reasonable assurance that he won't lose his investment if he gears his production to the nation's needs and to the nation's expectations. A farmer or a rancher doesn't want sympathy. Indeed, he doesn't want subsidy, if that's at all possible to avoid. He simply wants stable prices that will enable him to realize a fair return for his time, his energy, and the funds invested in a crop or in livestock. In the brief period of time that I've been in the Senate, quite a few legislative proposals have been offered and considered, and many more will be considered this next year. First, we must consider again the Agricultural and Consumer Protection Act of 1973, otherwise known as the Farm Bill, which we passed August 11, 1973, 14 months ago. Now, that piece of legislation, I believe, was sound when it was passed, but events have simply overtaken it to the point now where it really has very little relevance to the life of American farmers. First, the target price for corn when we passed it in the Senate was $1.53. By the time it got through the House, it was $1.38, and most important, the escalator clause that would have raised target prices commensurate with the costs of production, that would have kept the target price in line with the costs of production, were dropped because of the threat of a presidential veto. And so they were dropped for 1974 and 1975. And then the disaster assistance provisions became a disaster in themselves as they were interpreted by the USDA. With 2 consecutive years of runaway inflation distorting the costs of production, and 2 years of material shortage compounding the production problems, the reasonably good Farm Bill has lost all its glitter. A conservative estimate is that the average cost of production, now these have been carefully studied, the average cost of production since we passed that bill 14 months ago has risen almost exactly 50%. If you take all the costs of production in American agriculture since that bill was passed just a little more than a year ago. And so, above all, our first order of business in January is to raise the target price to match the increased costs of production. That's absolutely essential if that Farm Bill is going to mean anything at all. We have to do the same with the corn loan and the wheat loan rates, with the loan rates, because they too are now ridiculously small. We have to improve the disaster assistance provisions in the Farm Bill. They must be redefined. And both the assistance in the cases of prevented planting and low harvested yield must be improved to provide a producer with a reasonable guarantee that money invested in a crop will at least be returned. Now, frankly, we need George McGovern in there fighting with us and for us. We need his seniority, we need his experience, and we need his firmness of direction from the wheat and corn belt. Now, there are many other things I'd like to talk to you about: a recourse loan program, a Young Farmers Investment Act, the grain reserve. But this is your last meeting, and I've promised myself at least that I'm not going to talk too long. I know, for example, that a grain reserve is very controversial. I understand why people are suspicious of the Department of Agriculture constantly dumping on the market, as we've seen, to depress prices over the years. But George and Hubert Humphrey and I each have a grain reserve bill, and we're prepared to work together to resolve on one bill. I'm delighted that your organization is in support of a grain reserve program. I think the reason that so many people have been suspicious of the Department of Agriculture is this intolerable situation in which the major grain companies of this country have had such enormous influence. In fact, I asked the Secretary of Agriculture 8 days ago, when he came before the Senate Investigating Committee after the breaking the contract, something that I'd often wanted to ask. Why, in this country, we're not able to find people outside of the grain trade? And I'm not picking on people in the grain trade, but why we've not been able to find people outside of the grain trade who could hold high positions in the Department of Agriculture, where so much effect is felt, so much influence is felt from those companies. I pointed out, for example, that Secretary Butts himself had come off the board of the largest grain company in the country to serve as Secretary of Agriculture, that his predecessor, Secretary Hardin, had left the department to join that same largest grain company, that Clarence Palmby, the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture in charge of foreign sales, after having made the sale to the Soviet Union or participated in it, left the department to become a vice president of the same company that sold most of the wheat to the Soviet Union, that his replacement, Carol Brunthaver, was out of another major grain company, that the newly appointed monitor of this new grain system which we have, Mr. Shankler, is also out of one of the 5 major grain companies. I think it's that kind of close relationship, musical chairs, that has made so many of us suspicious of entrusting a grain reserve and other policies to this department. Well, it's been very, very interesting for me to be with you, to spend the day here, the afternoon here, and the night here. I think I would like to simply say in closing that I hope in these final days and in these final hours that you're going to do everything you can to send George McGovern back to the United States Senate. Certainly, he has represented you well in the Senate Agriculture Committee and on the floor of the House of Representatives. I ask you to continue to share your ideas, as you have in the past, as an organization and as individuals, with those of us who serve on the committee and in the Senate and the House. I ask the support of your organization for our efforts in the Senate. And I pledge to you individually and to your organization our total commitment to the principles of family-oriented agriculture in which all of us believe so firmly. But I make that commitment on one condition: that you send this man, George McGovern, back to help us and to help you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Clark, for taking your time and the energy to be with us, not just tonight, but all day here in South Dakota. We appreciate it very much. I have a card here that sent up to me that says that there